Hello, everybody. My name is Brandon Smith, and I am a software developer over at TBS Factoring Service here in town. We provide financial services for primarily the freight industry around the U.S. and a little bit abroad. And today we're going to talk about Flask, which is one of Python's frameworks, one of the most popular ones. And we're going to compare it a little bit with its big brother, Django. But in the meantime, let's scoot over and look at today's blueprint. So this is going to be our roadmap for today. We're going to start in, basically we're going to go through 4 sections, and it's going to be in the terminal mostly and in our code editor. So what we're going to have is 4 different Git branches, if you're familiar with Git, hopefully you are, and we're just going to walk through those. And each one of these sections here is going to be a different branch. That's also all out on GitHub, so if you want to go look at that to follow along or check it out later, you'll have that to reference, and I've got the slides on Slack as well, so feel free to go on there and look that up. Basically, we're going to start looking at Flask, basically what it is. Why would we want to use it? And in its most simplest form, we're going to look at an example app. Next, we'll move on to the templating engine inside of Flask, which is called Jinja 2. And it's pretty powerful, and we're going to look at some examples of how it can be used to inject our Python code into the HTML code. And then finally, we're going to go on to the last 2 sections, which is going to be a bit larger app, which will have a website and a Flask API all working together in the same application. And then the final section is going to be taking that application and creating it a different layout with the blueprints feature that Flask has available. And that really just helps your app scale and helps you organize that app as you go along. So first, we're going to talk about what is Flask. So it's a micro framework, which basically just means it comes very minimal. There's the packages included are listed here, and compared to Django, which they consider a batteries included framework, this one really leaves a lot up to you, how you want to arrange your app, how you want to pull different modules in or different packages to install and handle things like authentication or your login, your admin panel, things like that. They don't come included with the original Flask install, whereas Django does have a lot of that included. So with the micro framework here, we have a development server and debugger, and that basically just helps us on our development side. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that. We've got the templating engine that I referenced earlier, and we're able to declare URLs with the routing, and it has the functionality for sessions, so we can save things to cookies and persist that over people's user experience. So before we get started, Flask is still fairly new to me, so bear with me. Some of the terminology will probably be a little unique. I'm very new to the industry as well. Just 6 months ago, I was working in the construction industry and had been for the last 5 years, and I've recently switched over and now working here with TBS, and it's been one of the best moves and changes in my life, and I've learned a lot in the process. So if you have any questions, please, at the end, we'll have a little time where you can ask those, maybe make a note. If you remember which section it's a part of, write that down, and we can always come back and look later. And if not, reach out to me on Slack after that. So without any further ado, let's look at an actual Flask application. So I'll blow this up in a second. I just wanted you to see the entirety of this one file. If you look over in our tree to the left, we have an app.py file and a gitignore file, and that's just for this version control, so you can kind of ignore that. The app.py file declares everything we need to run this app in our development server. We've got the import at the top. We declare our application with what we imported. And then comparing to Django a little bit, this is where we declare our actual URL or our route. Obviously, this is the home URL, and this is the only place we have to declare that. We don't have to have a urls.py file and reference that in another one or anything extra. It's really up to us, and we can extract this, as you'll see later, into its own file as well. And then right under that decorator, to set the route, we have the actual function that is going to render the content that we want it to render. So right here, you can see we've just included some HTML code directly in our return statement, just to make sure that that works. So before we go on, let's go ahead and try running this. app.py. And there you can see our Server is running. We go over here to the browser, and there it is. Let me blow that up for you. We've got that little bit of HTML code that we had returned, and it's working in our browser now. If we want to change something, attendees, we have to go back to our terminal, restart this server, and if we go over and refresh, there it is. So as we develop, we've got a lot of functionality right off the bat with one single file in Flask. Makes it really easy. What I'm going to talk about first, though, for the beginners out there like me, I've been through countless tutorials with Flask, and it all looks different. And one thing in particular really confused me, and that is the command you use to start your server. You saw us use python app.py. That's pretty standard in a lot of tutorials, but you probably are also going to find Flask run. Flask run's a little bit newer. It's part of the CLI that Flask built into it in recent years, and it's really powerful. And I'm going to recommend going forward you start using this, read the documentation, and make sure you're comfortable with it. They both work, but they do things slightly different. And so I'm going to show you why this is useful right now. Basically, with Flask run, at the moment, we get the exact same result. We've got that server running. Now, what we're going to do, let me get back over here, is Flask run actually allows us to eliminate this bottom block of code, which checks to make sure that the command we're calling matches the file name we specified. So without that command, we can still run Flask run and run our app because Flask looks for that particular app.py file at the root. Another cool thing about it is we're going to try and optimize our code base a little bit because right now everything's sitting at the root of the folder. We're going to create a project folder and move our app inside there. So this is pretty typical and going to be very useful moving forward. You're going to want your app inside of its own folder because more than likely you're going to have testing associated with it. You're going to have maybe some other settings and some other management type files that you'll use in that root. And having everything under this project folder helps organize everything. But at the moment, that app.py is in the root, and if we try to run this, we're going to get an error because it couldn't find our app. And it says we either need to set this Flask app environment variable, or it's looking for a wsg.py or an app.py file. So, well, we had the app.py file, but it's not in the root. So let's go ahead and move that back out so that way Flask can see it. And inside our project folder, we're going to add a new file called init.py. Now, if you're familiar with classes in any programming language, but specifically in Python, the init method helps establish and initialize that class creation. Similar in this folder structure, you put that there to declare that this project folder is indeed a package with this app, but also you can call the project folder directly without having to reference its lower file. So what we're going to do is take all this stuff that we had in the app.py file, and we're going to drop it in our init.py file. So that's going to declare our app. And in order for Flask to read it back in that app.py file up in the root, we are just going to import it. So from project, the folder, import app. So now we've got that pulled through. You can see that we've got just two files. We've got our app.py and then a project folder holding our init.py file. And we should be able to run that just the same. Sure enough, it grabs it, and we're good to go. The last optimization I'm going to recommend you do, and you'll see this in the Flask documentation as well as any tutorial, is exporting a variable called Flask environment. Now, I was a very lazy developer when I was getting started, especially when I was trying to learn things really fast, and so the idea of having to type in export Flask environment equals development every time was just annoying to me, and I didn't see why I needed it. And so over time, I've learned a lot more why that's useful. When you set that variable, and we'll also look later at how you can automate that step and not have to manually enter it. When we set that, we toggle three things. Now when we run our server, you'll see we no longer have that red warning saying don't use the production environment. Now we have a development environment. We have the debug mode on, And we also have this thing called restarting with stat. So now over here, we can take our file, update it, and when we save it, it registers that, acknowledges it changed, and it reboots our server. So when we go over to the browser, it updated it without any need to go manually restart our server. So it's really useful when you're developing, set that environment variable, and you can just kind of make changes. Occasionally it gets snagged on something because you've had some syntax error and you might have to reset it, but for the most part, it's really, really helpful when you're getting things started and going. Sorry, let me make that a little bigger. Hopefully you can see. So the final thing to optimize our code, it's going to set the foundation for the last couple sections, is our HTML. And I promise I'm not going to be typing this entire time, so don't worry about that. Our HTML code is a little bit bulky, and as you can imagine, the more and more we have, that's not going to be scalable at all. So let's take that out, and what we're going to do is return a template instead. And there's a built-in method in Flask called renderTemplate. And in that, we're going to render an index.html file. Now, obviously, we don't have that file yet, but we're going to make it right under that project folder in a folder called templates. This is standard in Flask. You can change that template folder, but I don't really see any reason to unless maybe you're working with a existing app. And inside of that templates folder, we're going to make index.html. So most of your code editors have a shortcut for boilerplate HTML code. Mine's exclamation mark, you hit that, and there's all of our basic stuff we need. So now let's go ahead and put in a title. Let's copy, paste all that HTML we had before. There it is. And let's go ahead and restart that server. Clear that up so you can see it. And Flask run. If I did everything correctly, we should see exactly what we saw before. You'll notice if I change something in my HTML file now and save it, it updates automatically. And I don't know if you can see it, but up top in our title bar at the tab itself, it actually has a name, the title that we set. So now we have the ability to make a static website with Flask with just these two files. And the next section, we're going to look a little bit at what you can do with those HTML files because of the templating engine. So let me go ahead and get all these changes I made. I'm going to save them just so I don't lose them. And we're going to check out the next branch to look at our templates. So now as you can see, our folder looks pretty much the same. We still have our app file, looks the same way it did before. And all we did was add a static folder with one CSS file, just to add a little bit better view to look at than what we had before. And we still have our init.py file. The only thing that we added were two extra routes, one for users and one for API. So let's go ahead and just take a look at it and see what changed. Refresh this. And we have a little bit nicer looking website that looks a bit like something you might find browsing the web. And as we change these navigational buttons, you'll see the content updates automatically as well, just like you'd expect. The title changes up top, our URL gets populated, and our content down below changes with that. And what's cool about that with Flask and this templating engine, which is also shared by Django, is that we're only rendering a single HTML file in every, in every one of our routes. If you notice, it says render template index.html on all three. So this is where it got kind of fun to play with when I was getting started, because you can take Python code, conditionals, and some of their methods and things, and inject them directly into HTML. I'm sure the other frameworks for other languages have this, but this excites me because this is what I know. So here we have an example in our title. If the request.path is the home route, then I want it to say home. Else, if the request path is /users, I used another method that you can find in Python, and I grabbed the request path, did a string slice to take everything except that first / character, and then we threw the title case method on it, so it'll just capitalize the first. And so when we go over here and hit users, again, you can't see it really well, it's too small, but right up there in the tab, we have capitalized users, we have API, and that changes dynamically as we change the URL. As we look down, same kind of a thing. In your attributes for an element in HTML, we have the ability to change the class or the ID or any of the attributes dynamically with Flask as well. Like here, we can make it active depending on what's in the URL, so we can style that differently and do what we're doing here. And it's just kind of cool that you can do that with a single file. Not necessarily saying you should, that's not necessarily best practices, but the functionality is there, and if you're just having some time you want to sit down with Flask and play with it, it's really fun to find the things you can do. The final thing I'm going to show you on the template for now is this thing called block. And in its most basic form, a block is just where you declare, almost you give a variable content to whatever you put inside of there. So if you include this HTML document in another one, whatever you put in the block content area is going to override what was in it previously. So it allows you to, again, have some control over maybe default content that's shown, and then also gives you the ability to inject new content on different pages. You could also do that with the title, so instead of having conditionals, you just, on each page, reference that title, and we'll look at that in a second. So that is it for the template section. Now we're going to check out, if I can type, our next section, which has our combination app. And before we get there, I want to look at some of the dependencies that we now have on this upcoming version of the app. So before, those first two sections, all you needed was to pip install Flask. And by doing that, you were able to run everything we've just run without any extra dependencies or anything outside of that. So really, for a static website, with the one exception of when you go to deploy it and put it into production, there'll be some settings you need to adjust. You can get that running locally, and it's really easy and gives you a chance to start playing with it really quick. But moving forward, some of the things I've included is something called python.env. There's a lot you can do with it. All I used it for this example was to auto-set that Flask environment variable we talked about before. So anytime I run Flask run, it knows to look for a .env file, and whatever I declare in there, it's going to go ahead and include that in the environment. And so now that's one step I don't have to do, and it's relatively light dependency, so it's not that bad to include it. Unless somebody else knows more than I do on that, feel free to feed in at the end and let us know. I've also got SQL Alchemy and Flask SQL Alchemy included. Those are basically, in the simplest form, that allows us to send queries to our database, to get that data, to bring it back, and it gives us really nice shortcuts and readable language to send those queries, as opposed to a direct select statement or different types of variety of SQL that you might use. And it's an ORM, so it just helps abstract on that. Oop, we'll get there later. The next we have is PsychoPG2, which really is just the Postgres database adapter. And that's the database I used for this because it's really easy to set up and it scales really well. The last few, we have Flask Migrate, which allows us to run our database migrations. So if you want to add a column or add a new table or something like that, this helps make that really easy, especially with SQL Alchemy, to make those migrations with just two command line statements. Then we got Flask Cores, and those stand for cross-origin resource sharing. And if you start working with APIs especially, you're going to wind up using these pretty often, or I mean, it's going to be in your app. And this one I just used on our example for the ability to send a JavaScript request to call our API that we made. And that's just used kind of as an example, but also just to see that displayed on the screen dynamically, so we can do that on that last page, which you'll see shortly. And then WT Forms or Flask WTF, which is just the standard form creation tool that you can download or install for Flask. It's not necessary, but it makes it a lot easier, and I think I pretty much use it on everything from now on. So moving over, let's take a look at what all's changed. As you can see, our project grew quite a bit, but not really much is different. So we've got our app.py file still here in the root, and we have this manage.py file now as well. Now the manage.py, I won't go into it, but that's where we declare our migration variable and the ability to make a command line statement that will we'll do that. So really, if you're interacting with your database, you'll have something similar to that. I'm also going to show you in the next section how you can shorten that even and remove that file to do it more easily. We got a README file now. Here's that .env file I mentioned. I just threw that variable in there that we wanted to set, and it'll do it automatically. And then we've got two more up here, which the migrations is tied to the Flask migrate. Every time that you update that, we're not going to go into what it does, but it'll auto-generate, so you don't have to create that one. And then we have an instance folder up here that shows a configuration file in it, and that's where I set our Postgres route to connect to the database, and just a couple other settings that you're probably going to need in your app. But again, that stuff, going through any tutorial that connects to a database will be pretty straightforward. I chose to go the route of using the instance folder. There's like 4 other ways that you can upload those configuration settings and variables to your app, but I like this way. So looking in our project folder, we still have our static and templates folders, and we also have a few extra files. So now we still have init.py. It's shorter than it was before because we extracted all of our views or routes into their own file. So their own file is now called views.py. And in that, you can see there's all of our routes. And we've got a few more than before. We've got the home, users, API, and then some utility routes so we can add a user, we can update a user, delete, and then beyond that we have API endpoints. So now we've actually got an API that's running in this with us, and we'll get all the users, we'll get a user by their ID, included in the actual URL, and then we'll also get a companies endpoint to grab all the companies that are associated with them. So before we go any further, let's go ahead and look at this new form of the app. It won't look all that new on the home page, but now on our users page, we actually have a table with all of our different users in it. So as we look around, we can see that we've got a company, we've got a city, we've got a name and an ID, and this is the way it looks in our database. We have a single table in our database, and this is pulling all this information in. And you can see in our basic app, you're able to create a new user. If you click on one, you can update them and put whatever you want in there. And then we also have the ability, let me create one real quick. And there we are, new user. You can also delete them. Please don't make it that easy to delete something in your app. I have no prompt to confirm that you want to delete that person, but the functionality is there and you can abstract on that a bit further, but it works. So we know that works. If you want to go look at that later, this is the third section, third branch on that repo. And then here on the very end, our API section, I went ahead and put a few endpoints in there. And really, when we hit this request button, it's going to send that JavaScript request I mentioned earlier. And let's hit it. There's all of our users. It'll update automatically as we add new. And we've got the single user. You can call it by ID. And if you pass in companies, you got companies. Again, this is so far from a best practice. Do not make an API endpoint that looks like this, please. You have all that data already in your user's endpoint, but just to play with it, I was fiddling around with what we could do, and this is what happened. So as you can see, here's our companies all the way down. Standard API structure beyond that. So back into our folder, we've got a models file now that holds our actual user table, and this is where we declare each of those columns. And anytime you change this, you're going to run that migration tool to update it. And now we're going to look over real quick at the templates and just see that we have more than just our index file now. And one thing that changed is we have a base HTML file that has pretty much our boilerplate. So it's going to have our title, it's going to have all this metadata and the head information up top, and here in the middle we have our blocks. We've got a block called title, we've got a block called links, and we've got a navigation block, and then finally down below we have an empty block called content. So if you were to call the base HTML directly, you're not going to get any content, but when you call index, it has up the top of it, please extend the base HTML into this document. So now we get all that we put in that base HTML, and whatever block we declare overrides the one that was in the base. So now this is going to say OKC Python home because we overrode it there. And same thing in our content. Now we're injecting content where there was none before. So even though that app looked identical, or the website looked the same as it did before, it's actually functioning differently because it's calling that same information from multiple files now. And the rest of it's pretty straightforward. The only thing I'm going to show you extra beyond this is that, again, one of the cool features of the templating engine is that table grows and shrinks with however many people are in your database, and in Python it's really easy to make it do that. You can set here that if there are users, data.users, which is what I passed in, a variable called data that had a directory or a dictionary inside of it with a users item. If that exists, then I want to grab every user, for every user in that data.users, render a new table row. And in that table row, I want to give basically an anchor link so I can update that user from any one of those. And I also want to grab their user ID, their user name, and title that in case it was lowercase, and company and city. So again, it's just really cool that you can dynamically drag all this stuff in, and with the declaration of a single table row, you are able to generate every row for the ones that are in your database. Again, a lot like a lot of other programming languages, but it's just really simple in Flask the way that's introduced and made available to us. So other than that, I think the only thing I added in here was a reference to our JavaScript file that will make that call, and you can feel free to go look at that here in the static .api.js file, and it just grabs those buttons and runs that against our local host at 5000 port, and then calls that API endpoint that we made. So this will should function the same on your computer. The GitHub repo should have everything you need if you want to go through that. Finally, we're going to move on to the last section. And let's see, let's delete that. Just a quick overview of what we did. Most of everything stayed the same on the outside. The only thing that changed is we got rid of the manage.py file that had probably 30 lines of code to allow us to update our database, and we replaced it with a single line of code in our app.py file to set a migrate variable. And by doing just that and that alone, obviously we have to import it from above and get our database as well, we are able to come into our terminal and now run Flask database migrate as our command to update our database and add new columns and tables and whatever it is we're going to do, which is a lot shortened compared to running Python manage.py database migrate and then upgrade. So again, something that helps speed up the process and saves you quite a bit of code in your project folder. So real quick, before we actually look at the code, let's run it again. And on this last example, we'll see a few things have changed. Now we have a slightly different user table that has, as you can see, every company is tied to a city specifically that doesn't change. So anybody that's in the same company has the same city associated with them now, and that's because we now have two tables. We have a user table and we have a companies table. And I included this just because for me, it was really hard to find a good example of Flask using multiple tables and then making those relationships work in an application that I can build, except for little snippets here and there on different sites. And so I put it on here. Hopefully it's helpful for you if you want to reference it. If you've already done it, then it's probably a really basic example, but it's really cool how that works. And over here we have our companies table, and you've got even a little extra information that we don't display on the other one, which is revenue, address, and they've got their own ID that we tie to. And same as before, you can create a new company. You can create your new user. One thing that changed is when you create a new user, you no longer have to give them any more information other than just their company. So you drop in here and it'll grab dynamically from our other table any of the options that we've created. So if I make a new company, it's going to be available here, and we can save it, and there they are. And it obviously pulls in the name of that company as well as that city from the company's table. And so then finally, on our API endpoints, there's one other thing we did on this, and that is added some versioning to our API. So as most of you know, Flask is really popular for building an API. It's just kind of what you hear about the most when you're talking about why would I use Flask. And the blueprints feature really makes this part fun and exciting and easy to manage, especially when you're wanting to make versions, because you can set a different blueprint for each version and they can all run simultaneously and you're not stepping over on each other. And we'll look at that code in just a second. It'll be real quick. But here you can see we still have our API. Now we have a V1 injected in that route too to identify which version it's a part of. We have a user request, and before we included the ID directly in the URL. Now we're passing it in as a query string, and this is pretty common in a lot of APIs. I really just put it there so you could have an example of both. We'll look briefly at the function to see how that pulls it, and they still function the same. But as you'll see, our users now look a little different. We don't have a company name in there or a city. We just have the company ID, and that maps directly to our company endpoint, their ID, and that ties those together. And so simply by that connection, basic database logic, you're able to now grab all of these other things. And I will show you real quick how we do that in the template because it's very easy in Flask. So here is our folder structure again. Within the project, we now have two new folders. We've got an API folder and we've got a portal folder. And this really is how the blueprints, let me zoom in on that a little bit, the blueprints shine. Because before we had our init file and that's where everything was called. And now we come down and instead of just importing the routes, we are able to register a blueprint and we create those blueprints in each of those folders. So they're all segmented. We've got API stuff with the API stuff. We've got portal or website stuff with the portal stuff. And you can take that as far as you want and nest that as deep as you want. And this is a pretty generic way to model that. Here's our models file with now our company table as well as our users. But if we look at it, we still have our templates and static. And let's look at the portal first. We only have two things in it. We've got our views.py file, and it looks just like our other route where we have, zoom out one, where we declare our URL, and then we have a little function that grabs it and puts it all out there for us. And we only have to add one thing at the top to declare it as a blueprint, and that's right here. We import it directly from Flask, so there's no extra dependency to use blueprints. And once you set this, and we passed in an optional parameter of template folder, and that just allowed us to give that folder its own templates folder. So we can put HTML documents underneath the portal now, and it all just works together and talks to itself. And if we leave that out, then we'll just by default use the template folder that's at the root of the project folder. Same thing over here in our API. We also have, let me collapse that, we also have a templates and a views.py just like our portal. But now we also have a static folder and V1 and V2. So without doing my best to confuse you anymore on this, you can see here the four blueprints that we've made. We've made a portal, an API, and then a V1 and a V2. And what those do, portal grabs everything for our website and displays it. Our API grabs just the API page. You don't have to extract it from it, but I did just for an example. And then you get these cool parameters you can pass in, like URL prefix. And that allows us to prefix our route with API in one location. So if I go in and create a route that's /companies, it's now going to be /API/companies because of this prefix we set in the init.py file. So this has gotten to be a lot more to show, and I'm trying to make sure you can see enough of it to know what's going on. But all that to say, now we have in our V1 and V2 folders that are nested down beneath single routes.py files. And in those, we declare their own blueprint, and we just import those right back up the chain to that init file, and then we've got them accessible and usable through our app immediately. So I that's really about all I wanted to show you with Flask. There was a lot of information in there, and toward the end, I know that probably got a little hard to see what all was happening, but if you have the time and you want to go look at this on GitHub, please go on there, take a look. Feel free to reach out to me. I go by the moniker Brickbeard just about everywhere online, so Slack and Twitter and everywhere you can reach me at that. There's the repo. It's also in Slack. And I went ahead and attached a few tutorial links that I used that were really helpful, that helped bridge that gap between your general tutorials and then the ones that, you know, I guess really got so confusing I didn't know what was going on. So yes, thank you all for the time and the patience with this talk. And if you have any questions about the stuff we talked about, we have time for that. We can do that now or come talk to me after.